Throughout the Second World War, scores of war crimes and atrocities were committed in the Pacific and across Asia by the Japanese army. It's believed that roughly 14 million civilians and prisoners of war were executed or slaughtered by the Japanese forces during the conflicts of the Second World War and before. There were cities such as Nanking, where the soldiers rampaged throughout, executing, assaulting, and doing whatever they pleased, as the commanding officers either encouraged the behaviour or turned a blind eye to it. At the end of the war, there were a number of senior Japanese members of government who were brought to trial in Tokyo to answer for the widespread war crimes, and some people were executed for their conduct. But some believe that the Emperor Hirohito should have been tried as a warmonger and a major war criminal. Inside of different courtrooms, there were some Japanese generals who were condemned and were then taken to the gallows for their crimes. Welcome to The Untold Past. Today we look at the execution of the Japanese generals of World War II, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Yamashita was the son of a doctor, and in November 1905 he graduated from the Japanese Army Academy and was considered top of his class. He fought in World War I, and in May 1916 he was promoted to the rank of captain. Then he served as a military attaché in Bern and Berlin around 1920, and 2 years later he was promoted to the rank of major. He served inside the Japanese War Ministry and aimed to help to reform and streamline the Japanese army. He also worked inside the imperial headquarters, and further promotion came his way, but he became a rival to Hideki Tojo and other military generals and leaders. He later fell from favour in the eyes of Emperor Hirohito, as he wanted leniency for those rebel officers who were involved in a coup, and with this Yamashita resigned from the army as he had lost the faith of the emperor. Before the Second World War broke out in Europe, he wanted Japan to end the conflict with China, and he also wanted to keep peace with America and Britain, but his ideas were dismissed and ignored. He was later assigned the command of the 4th Division, which saw action in northern China, and he was then sent on a military mission to Germany and Italy, and whilst here would meet Hitler and Mussolini. Yamashita wanted the army to be continually evolving, but his ideas rubbed people up the wrong way, and he did have a significant amount of tension with Hideki Tojo, the war minister. But on the 6th of November 1941, General Yamashita was put in command of the 25th Army, and he believed that victory in Malaya could occur if the soldiers he had could make an amphibious landing. The Malayan campaign ended with the fall of Singapore, and with Japanese forces pushing through, and in February 1942, Yamashita's 30,000-strong frontline soldiers captured 80,000 British, Australian and Indian troops, which led to the largest surrender of British soldiers in history. For this, Yamashita was called the Tiger of Malaya, and his soldiers occupied Singapore and the area around. But inside of Singapore there were huge numbers of Japanese war crimes committed against Allied captured personnel, and also civilians. One massacre, the Alexandria Hospital massacre, saw Japanese forces break into the hospital and slaughter a number of doctors and nurses with bayonets and bullets, but they also killed a number of patients too, and many people were forced into small, unventilated rooms, which were overcrowded, and they were given no food or water, which resulted in even more death. Many had to pretend to lay dead for hours to survive. Another massacre at Suqing led to around 25 to 50,000 deaths. The Japanese targeted a number of people, and there were many execution sites which claimed the lives of hundreds of victims. The Japanese wanted to get rid of ethnic Chinese people who were deemed hostile to them, and with this thousands were rounded up and were shot by rifles and machine guns. Whether Yamashita had ordered these events, or whether he was actually responsible for these, still remains debatable today, and some believe he was not, but some believe he actually was. The order to execute 50,000 Chinese people allegedly came from senior officers within Yamashita's staff, and his troops had regularly fought in battles where afterwards they carried out huge killings to keep the population quiet. Yamashita would later apologise to the survivors of a massacre, and even caught some of his soldiers looting and punished them. It was said he gave the order no looting, no assault, no arson, that any soldier committing these acts would be punished. But these warnings were not listened to, and there were large-scale acts of violence, but he continued to be arguing with the War Ministry. He treated some prisoners of war humanely, which was not considered acceptable, but he then was reassigned in July 1942 to Manchukuo, and was given a post commanding the 1st Area Army. This kept him quiet during the Pacific War, and Tojo, the Prime Minister, was responsible for ousting him and keeping him away. But on the 26th of September 1944, as the war was going poorly for the Japanese, Yamashita was brought back in from the cold after Tojo and his cabinet fell from power. He took command of the 14th Area Army to defend the Philippines. American forces would land, but Yamashita was in command of 262,000 soldiers in defensive formations. He did not declare Manila an open city before its capture, meaning that defending militaries will not defend the city in battle. This was supposed to be done to save the lives of many and the city, but Manila turned into a huge battlefield, and there were large-scale atrocities and deaths. Street-to-street fighting broke out, and it's believed that 100,000 civilians were killed. But after the surrender of Japan, from the 29th of October to the 7th of December 1945, Yamashita was placed on trial in Manila for war crimes relating to the massacre and the atrocities against the civilians and prisoners of war. He was held responsible, and he nodded his head when asked by his subordinates to execute people without trial. The main accusation was that he failed in his duty as a commander of the Japanese forces to prevent atrocities, and he failed to control those soldiers. Their crimes were placed onto him, and one witness claimed that Yamashita had said, "Wipe out the whole Philippines, since everyone in their islands was either guerrillas or active supporters of the guerrillas." The defence claimed he was not involved in war crimes specifically, and he denied any knowledge of crimes committed by his men. He said he would have punished them harshly if he knew, and he said that, "My command was as big as MacArthur's or Lord Louis Mountbatten's. How could I tell if some of my soldiers misbehaved themselves? It was impossible for any man in my position to control every action of his subordinate commanders, let alone the deeds of individual soldiers. The charges are completely new to me. If they had happened and I had known about them, I would have punished the wrongdoers severely. But in war someone has to lose. What I'm really being charged with is losing the war." General Yamashita was found guilty of war crimes and was sentenced to death. His trial was criticised, and some believed it was a miscarriage of justice. There was an appeal for clemency, but the death sentence was confirmed. Yamashita was held at Los Banos Laguna prison camp, 30 miles south of Manila, and he was to remain there until his execution. He was led out to the gallows in the courtyard, and there were 13 steps he was led up by the prison guards. He was then passed over to the executioner, who asked him for any final words. It was claimed that he then said, "As I said in the Manila Supreme Court, I have done with all my capacity, so I don't to shame in front of the gods for what I have done when I died. But if you say to me, you do not have any ability to command the Japanese forces, I shall say nothing for it, because it is my own nature. Now our war criminal trial, going under your kindness and right. I know that all your American and American military affairs always has tolerance and rightful judgment. When I have been investigated in Manila Court, I have had good treatment, kindful attitude from your good-natured officers, who protected me all the times. I never forget for me what they have done to me, even if I had died. I don't blame my executioner. I pray the gods bless them. Please send my thankful word to Colonel Clark and Lieutenant Colonel Feldhaus, Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks, Major Guy, Captain Sandberg, Captain Reel at Manila Court, and Colonel Arnold. I thank you." After this, the executioner placed a noose around his neck, along with a cap, and final checks were made, before he was placed over the trapdoor, and then the lever was released that opened it. Yamashita passed through, and within seconds he was dead. Today, General Tomoyuki Yamashita's execution remains a controversial one, as his trial set a precedent called commander responsibility, meaning a commander could be held accountable for the crimes of his soldiers, even if he did not order them to specifically do something. He was a skilled military commander who forced the worst disaster in British military history, but under his command a huge number of war crimes were committed by the Japanese army. Yoshio Tachibana was born on the 24th of February 1890, and following graduating from a private school, he attended the 25th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. He studied for a number of years and graduated in 1913, and he then became an officer. He would later be promoted to captain in August 1923, and he then the following year was given command of a battalion of the Japanese 12th Infantry Regiment. He would also serve on the staff of the 11th Division, and he was later sent to speak to high schools to boost numbers of soldiers. He then became a major in August 1930, then a lieutenant commander 5 years later. He was present as a liaison officer for the Manchukuo Imperial Army, but then as the Second World War broke out, he was given further command of more regiments. He took control of the 65th Infantry Regiment, which saw a lot of action during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Interestingly, in 1942, he was then assigned to the staff of the Hiroshima Regional Defence Command, and further promotion occurred. But in May 1944, he became the commander of the 1st Independent Combined Brigade, who were defending the Ogasawara Islands against American invasion. His final promotion came at the end of World War II, when he became a lieutenant general, and he took command of the 109th Division in the final stages of the war. However, by mid-1945, as the end of the war was looming, the Allied naval blockade was causing chaos and suffering to 25,000 Japanese soldiers on Chichijima. They were running low on food and supplies, and the daily ration of rice had been reduced from 400 grams per person a day to 240. The troops, because of this, were not at risk of starving to death, but Tachibana, who was commanding his soldiers here, would turn to cannibalism at the time. They were desperate, but what they did out of desperation was shocking and a horrific war crime. In late 1944, the Japanese had managed to shoot down a number of Allied bombing aircraft during bombing raids on Chichijima, and 9 airmen managed to escape from their aircraft before they were killed. They managed to get to the island, which was 700 miles south of Tokyo, and whilst here, Lloyd Woolhoff, James Dye, Grady York, Glenn Fraser Jr., Marvel Mershon, Floyd Hall, Warren Earl Vaughan, and Warren Hinderland were captured. They were held in tough conditions inside of a prison on the island, and they were subjected to terrible treatment. The men would be interrogated daily, and they were also beaten very badly, and they were tortured for information. One man who managed to evade capture during these bombing raids and attacks was the future American President George H.W. Bush, who had been shot down, and at the time was a 20-year-old pilot inside of the American Air Force. The American airmen were held for a number of months, however the order was then given for Tachibana's men to execute them. It was specifically General Tachibana who gave the order and the execution instructions, and the men were to be executed by beheading. Interestingly, the story of one of the captives was rather different to the other men. I've omitted his name just because of this. It was said that this soldier was friendly to the Japanese captors, and he learned of a few words of Japanese. It was said he attended parties and drank sake with his captors. When American bombers appeared overhead, he ran into caves along with the Japanese. He had always been clever. This was a guy who worked his way up from enlisted man to officer, from cook to flyboy. Now he was teaching himself the Japanese language and customs well enough to use chopsticks and joke with his captors. Maybe he would be lucky. But then his luck would run out, as an order was issued to execute him also. The Japanese officials who became friends with him avoided being his executioner, but he was too beheaded like the other Americans. Shockingly, after his execution, it was said that his body was dissected by the island's doctor so they could examine his insides. His liver and thigh were removed too. At night the liver was pierced with bamboo sticks and cooked with soy sauce and vegetables, and served along with alcohol. It's believed that at least 4 other airmen who were executed were subjected to cannibalism, as their remains were consumed by senior staff at Tachibana's ranks. The medical orderlies carried out autopsies and removed parts of the body, and then it was said it was the senior officers who indulged in acts of cannibalism. Tachibana had developed a reputation of his own during the Second World War, and he was known for being a sadistic, alcoholic commander who would order executions at the drop of a hat. The men who were executed were all beheaded by sword by Tachibana's men, and this was considered a rather medieval execution. However, the Allies would then learn of the executions of the American airmen, and subsequently the cannibalism that occurred there also. At the time, military and international law did not deal with cannibalism, and Tachibana and 11 other Japanese soldiers and doctors were tried with the murder and prevention of honourable burial. The case was investigated in 1947 as a war crime, and 30 Japanese soldiers were prosecuted, and 4 officers were sentenced to death after being found guilty of their evil killing of the airmen. General Tachibana was one of those sentenced to death, along with Major Matoba and Captain Yoshio. Another medical officer was condemned, but he was then imprisoned instead for 8 years, like the enlisted men who were found guilty. Tachibana, on the 24th of September 1947, at the age of 57 on Guam, was brought to the gallows. He was brought into the clearing of a military prison, and there was a gallows which stood in the centre. He was led up the stairs before the executioner asked him for final words, and then he placed the cap over his head, followed by the noose. He was then shuffled over the trapdoor, and then his execution occurred very swiftly. General Yoshio Tachibana, during the Second World War, had a reputation for being a brutal alcoholic general, who would order the executions and commit many crimes. Shockingly, there was a belief inside the Japanese military that consuming the human liver had medical benefits, and a vice admiral would later be executed in a separate trial exactly for this. But under Tachibana's command and control, his soldiers and men committed a number of horrific war crimes, and despite the fact there was a shortage of food, they turned to the ultimate evil after the execution of the Allied men, which in itself was unjust. Masao Baba was born in January 1892 inside of the Kumamoto prefecture, and he was the son of a lieutenant who had a long history inside of the Japanese army. Masao would follow in his father's footsteps, and he would attend military schools from childhood, and he then went to Army Cadet School in Hiroshima. The education he was given was based on a Prussian academy and a Prussian style of teaching, and he would graduate from the 24th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in December 1912, when he was 20. He trained and specialised as a cavalry soldier, and then when he was a second lieutenant he became part of the Imperial Japanese Army's 5th Cavalry Regiment. Baba continued to train, and he was part of the 33rd class of the Army War College, and he continued as a cavalry soldier throughout his military career. He even became part of the Inspectorate of the Cavalry, and continual promotions led to him becoming a colonel, and he was then given command of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. But in July 1938, Baba became a Major General, and he served as a commanding officer of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade as the Second World War broke out. He continued to rise throughout the ranks, and he became the Commander-in-Chief of all cavalry operations in the Pacific. He would be assigned to Inner Mongolia to oversee the cavalry operations there, but he then became the commander of the 53rd Division, and he was appointed the commander of the 4th Division in Sumatra. He must have been a very well-respected member of the military, as he was continually given command of different divisions and groups, and with this he then became the Commander-in-Chief of the 37th Army in Borneo. Whilst he was in Borneo, Masao Baba was involved in the anti-guerrilla operations inside of the island, and he would lead soldiers to hunt down guerrilla fighters. However, it was inside of the country where he would be linked to a crime that would result in his execution. The Sandakan death marches were a number of forced marches in Borneo, in which prisoners of war were driven from Sandakan to another town. In 1942 and 1943, Australian and British POWs that had been captured at the Battle of Singapore were taken to North Borneo to make a military airstrip, and a number of prisoner of war camps at Sandakan. Prisoners were forced at gunpoint to work, and they were also beaten whilst they were given little food and medical help. The conditions got worse for the prisoners after a number of officers were moved to a different camp. The Japanese further reduced the rations, and they also forced sick prisoners to work very hard. There were 3 stages of marches, with the first taking place across dense forest, and 470 prisoners were forced to carry baggage and supplies for the Japanese battalions. Most of the prisoners were malnourished and were suffering from serious illness, and the route took 9 days, and the men only had supplies for 4 days. It was said that within days most collapsed en route, or were killed by the Japanese soldiers. A month later, only 6 who had embarked on the route survived. A second march took place, and this lasted 26 days, with over 500 prisoners being given even fewer rations. A final march took place with 250 people being left to starve to death on a large march, but most inmates did not survive after walking 50 kilometres. It was said that a number of the Japanese soldiers also suffered from starvation, and they even turned to cannibalism to survive themselves. There had been a rescue operation planned for those who were held at the Sandakan camp. However, this was cancelled due to inaccurate intelligence. Because of the lack of food and the brutal treatment by Japanese forces, there were only 38 prisoners who were left alive. All of those were too weak to do any work, and it was ordered that any survivors should be shot. Masao Baba was linked to this awful treatment, and it was said that over 2,200 Australian prisoners of war died in the terrible death march. However, after the Second World War had come to an end, any commander or general within the Japanese army who was linked to the area where the death marches took place was convicted of war crimes under the command principle. This is where, as the generals did not step in to stop this sort of behaviour, they were also believed to have been liable for the actions of their soldiers as much as the perpetrators were. This principle was later used in war crimes trials against those men who were linked to crimes at Nanking and the atrocities which were carried out there. In January 1947, years after the Second World War had come to an end, General Masao Baba was arrested and was brought to trial for his involvement in crimes against humanity. He was taken to Raoul for trial, and he was found guilty of his involvement in the Sandakan Death March due to the command principle. Much evidence was heard, and some stated that Baba was aware of the weak conditions of the prisoners and the fact they were suffering. However, he gave direct orders for a second march to take place, showing that there was orders given by Baba that would inflict more suffering and death onto prisoners of war. Because of this, he was sentenced to death and was to be executed following a trial that lasted 8 days. On the 7th of August 1947, Masao Baba was led from his prison cell inside of Raoul in New Guinea, and he was led to where a gallows had been created. He was then led up the execution device, and a rope and cap was placed over his head, and within seconds the executioner released a trapdoor, and he was left hanging. What is interesting is that it's clear that General Masao Baba had a huge disregard for the lives of prisoners of war, but he also had a disregard for his own soldiers' lives at times. When he ordered the death marches, he may have thought that these would take place through easy and flat jungle, which could be traversed, but this would not be the case. Many Japanese soldiers were later found dead, having decided to die by their own hands from trees in the jungle, due to the tough conditions they were forced to go on the march with as well. He was a commanding officer who could not protect his prisoners and his own men, and for this and many other crimes, General Masao Baba was sentenced to death and was executed years after the war came to an end. Takashi Sakai was born on the 18th of October 1887, and he was born in the Kamo district of Hiroshima. As many young men would in Japan, he would pursue a career inside of the military, and he would then attend military school to prepare his career as a soldier, and he studied in Japanese cities before he graduated from the 20th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1908. Following this, he was assigned to the 28th Infantry Regiment, and he would then graduate from the 28th class of the Army Staff College. But in 1928, Sakai was based in the Shandong province in China during a Jinan incident. This was when Japanese soldiers had been based in the region to protect the Japanese commercial interest, and peace would be broken between the Chinese and Japanese, and this resulted in the deaths of civilians, as around 16 Japanese civilians were killed and 28 soldiers died, but on the Chinese side there were over 6,000 civilians and soldiers killed. The Japanese reprisals were brutal and barbaric, and there was a lack of understanding and remorse. But some historians claim that Sakai's forces were responsible for the slaughter of Chinese army emissaries during peace negotiations. But following this, Takashi Sakai was promoted to the rank of colonel, and he then served for a number of years inside of the military intelligence, and he then became involved in the general staff of the army. As a chief of staff to the Japanese China Garrison Army, Sakai would be involved in the planning and waging war and conflict with the Chinese, and he would become a significant aggressor. But there would be an armistice with the Chinese government, but this gave concessions to the Japanese, and in particular gave them Hebei province. But then further promotions came, and Sakai was made the commander of the 28th Infantry Brigade, and he would then be made a Major General in 1937, before becoming a Lieutenant General 2 years later. He continued to command, and during the Second World War, he was the commander of the 23rd Army based in Canton. but he would then be involved in the capture of Hong Kong, and he was ordered to use the 38th Division to take the region. On the 8th of December 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces who were commanded by Sakai and his chief of staff invaded Hong Kong. This resulted in the Battle of Hong Kong. Sakai hoped for this to be over quickly, but it took a lot longer than he expected, but eventually the Japanese would be victorious. The Hong Kong garrison was made up of British, Indian and Canadian forces, as well as Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps. Japanese fighters and bombers attacked when they could, and they pushed back the British and Indian troops. But retreating forces had gone scorched earth, as oil tanks and dockyards were blown up, but the Japanese would assault Hong Kong. Thousands were killed, and eventually Hong Kong did surrender. The surrender was delivered in person to General Sakai, and then Hong Kong would fall under Japanese occupation. It's believed that thousands were killed or missing for the Commonwealth forces during the battle, and that around 10,000 prisoners were captured, and these were then subjected to horrific treatment at the hands of the Japanese. Takashi Sakai was frustrated by the strong resistance that he and his forces faced, and this may have been a contributing factor to the occupation of Hong Kong, and specifically how the people were treated. The occupation would last 3 years and 8 months, and there was a huge amount of fear inside the region, and the population would dwindle by 1 million, as people were sent to prisoner of war camps, or they fled or suffered. There was inadequate food supply, and people were given measly rations, and because of this many died from starvation. There were also many atrocities committed by Sakai's forces against the locals, and many women were assaulted. Some were deported to become comfort women for the Japanese army, and it's estimated that around 10,000 civilians were executed or were tortured or attacked. There were many other villages which were slaughtered, and Hong Kong suffered greatly. But Sakai would serve as the Japanese governor of Hong Kong until February 20th, 1942, and he was then later recalled to Japan, but he would retire from active service a year later. But then he would be recalled at the end of the conflict in 1945, and he was then to be sent to Beijing, but before he could get there and leave for China, the war would come to an end. But at the end of the Second World War, Sakai would be captured, and he was arrested by the American occupation authorities. There were a series of war crimes trials that took place to punish Japanese members of government and also the military, who had conducted war crimes and atrocities. At the request of the Chinese government, Takashi Sakai was extradited to China, where he committed many of his crimes, and he was then brought to trial for these specific war crimes. Specifically, he was part of the Nanking War Crimes Tribunal, and this saw a number of high-profile military leaders on trial alongside Sakai, and for his crimes inside of Hong Kong, he was then sentenced to death. The War Crimes Tribunal said about his actions that the tribunal dismissed the accused plea that he could not be held responsible for the above violations because they were perpetrated by his subordinates, and he had no knowledge of them. The tribunal's findings were as followed: that a field commander must hold himself responsible for the discipline of his subordinates is an accepted principle. It is inconceivable that he should not have been aware of the acts or atrocities committed by his subordinates. All the evidence goes to show that the defendant knew of the atrocities committed by his subordinates and soldiers, and deliberately let loose savagery upon civilians and prisoners of war. The principle that a commander is responsible for the discipline of his soldiers, and that consequently he may be held responsible for their criminal acts if he neglects to undertake appropriate measures or knowingly tolerates the perpetration of offences on their part, is a rule generally accepted by nations and their courts of law in the sphere of the laws and customs of war. But Takashi Sakai would be executed in a manner that was different to other convicted Japanese war criminals. As a strong military man, it was said he would be executed on a firing range, and by gunshot, which was considered a more honourable way to die for a soldier. He was led out to the firing range on the 30th of September 1946, and the 58-year-old general was then secured to a stake, and he had his arms and legs tied to a post. Then opposite him was a Chinese execution squad. He had been taken to Nanking for his execution, but then the firing squad was readied, and when the order was given to shoot straight, they did, and executed the former Japanese governor of Hong Kong. Takashi Sakai was a notorious Japanese war criminal, and he was a man who was known for his brutality. He took part in horrific atrocities in Hong Kong and in surrounding areas, and the soldiers under his command he was responsible for were horrific. He would be executed as he was a commander and a general, and the command principle meant he was responsible for the actions of his soldiers, even if he did not specifically order the crimes they committed. But as mentioned, he would not be hanged like many other generals were, but instead was shot. Heitaro Kimura was born in the Saitama Prefecture on the 28th of September 1888 to the north of Tokyo, but he was as a young child raised by his family in the area around Hiroshima. As a young boy, like many inside of Japanese society, he was told that the noblest thing he could do growing up was to join the military and to lay his life down for the Japanese emperor, and because of this Kimura, at a young age, attended military schools. These schools then fed into the Imperial Japanese Army academies, and he attended these and then graduated at the age of 19. Further study came inside of Japanese academies, and he attended the Army War College and served inside of an artillery regiment and inside different detachments. This began his long career inside of the military, in which he would later serve in a global conflict. But he saw action during the Japanese-Siberian intervention and supported the whites against the Red Army of the Soviet Union. Kimura, though, was a reliable official inside of the army, and he was later dispatched to Germany to serve as a military attaché, and he corresponded with different nations and their military hierarchies at this time. But he continued in the artillery field schools, and because of his skill at commanding groups of artillery, he would then be made an inspector, and it was his job to train others and demonstrate what he had learned. He also attended the London Disarmament Conference, which aimed to address issues regarding warships, submarines, and further naval warfare. This aimed to regulate future warfare. However, when he got back to Japan, he was made a lieutenant colonel and was then given command of the Imperial Japanese Army's 22nd Artillery Regiment. He continued to teach inside of the schools, educating young soldiers who would later become valuable in the conflicts in Asia. But he continued to rise throughout the ranks of the army and then became involved in politics, and he was made the chief of the Control Section in the Economic Mobilization Bureau based inside the Ministry of War, and he then later became the head of the Ordnance Bureau. In this, he was responsible for the gathering of ordnance and artillery shells and other projectiles, but in 1936 he then became a general for the first time. As the Second World War broke out and before, he was given service on the front lines commanding the Japanese 32nd Division, based in China, and then as the Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army. These soldiers, though, became notorious for their war crimes and for the slaughter they conducted upon the enemy, and because of this, his force's actions would later send him to the gallows. Despite this brief stint on the front lines, he was then recalled back to the Ministry of War and served under Hideki Tojo as the Vice Minister of War. Kimura was now in a very significant position in the Japanese war effort, and he was involved in planning attacks which would later be deployed during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and also against the Americans in the Pacific. He continued to be a powerful member of the military planning, and was a member of the Supreme War Council, and much of his power was at the expense of other members, and Kimura tended to dominate much of the proceedings. However, in 1944, the Japanese war effort was turning against them, and because of this, Kimura was sent to the front lines again, and he was now made the Commander-in-Chief of the Burma Area Army. Burma was known for its treatment of prisoners of war, but the army based there were not the most well-equipped, as other members of the Japanese forces were, and the US and UK attacks upon naval shipping lanes caused problems for the Japanese forces in the region. The situation was not good, and Kimura was sent to deal with it, and the Allies also had established air superiority over the nation, and there were also not many reinforcements sent. The Japanese military hierarchy believed that Kimura would be the one who could solve all of the problems, and that under his leadership they believed that Burma could fight back against the Allies. However, this was very short-sighted, and Kimura was forced to retreat, and the supplies inside of Burma became even more stretched. Different key strategic positions were taken by the Allies, and Heitaro Kimura then made the decision to protect his forces that he had, rather than to go and defend Rangoon, and he decided not to issue an order to surrender, which would have resulted in more loss of life. But he was then promoted again and ended the war with the final rank of general outright, before the war came to an end, and at the time of the Japanese surrender he was still trying to reorganise troops in the possibility of further attacks, but he had bigger problems on the horizon to worry about. Heitaro Kimura, as he was the Vice Minister of War, was a wanted war criminal. At the end of the conflict, the American authorities wanted to hold those men responsible who had organised the Japanese war effort and who had been responsible for the slaughterous actions of soldiers and civilians inside of the army. Kimura was arrested by the Allies, and he was then taken to the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, or the Tokyo Trials as it was known. He was charged with war crimes, and it was said that he was responsible for the planning and the strategy for the war in China, and also in Southeastern Asia, and for this he was held responsible for the crimes of soldiers, which included looting, murder, assault on a huge scale, and arson. He was also accused of not doing enough in his role in Burma in preventing the terrible treatment that Allied prisoners of war were subjected to. The Burma Railway had already been built whilst he was there, but he was also accused and linked to the abuse and deaths of the prisoners of war and the civilians who were used to build the terrible railway. There were a huge number of crimes Kimura was accused of, and for this he was sentenced to death, alongside his former colleague Hideki Tojo and others. He was then transported back to Sugamo prison to await his death sentence in Tokyo. It was on the 23rd of December 1948 that the men condemned at the Tokyo trial were executed. Kimura was taken from his prison cell, and he had been appointed a Buddhist faith leader and also a priest to give him spiritual guidance for his execution and to help him through it. He was taken from his prison cell and was taken to the execution chamber, where a gallows had been built with a trapdoor, which was used for the executions. As he approached the scaffold, Kimura's identity was confirmed, and the executioner then acted quickly and placed a black cap over his head, followed by a noose, and he then shuffled Heitaro Kimura over the trapdoor and made final checks before this was released. Minutes later, Kimura was confirmed dead, and his remains were then hastily and quickly cremated. Heitaro Kimura was one of the most senior men of the Japanese war effort during the Second World War, and he was for his actions sentenced to death for war crimes. His crimes included waging war, and he was a man who was sent in by other officials to deal with the problems inside of the Japanese war effort, and he was seen as a very competent general. But inside of Sugamo prison, alongside other men, such as his friend Hideki Tojo, Kimura was executed and was left hanging.
Hideki Tojo was born in the Kojimachi district of Tokyo, Japan, on December 30, 1884. His father was a Japanese Army Lieutenant General, and he followed in his father's footsteps in the military. He had a typical Japanese education, and at the time this was to train the boys to be soldiers as adults, and it was relentlessly driven into Japanese children that war was a beautiful thing. It was also taught that the greatest honour for a Japanese man was to die for his country and for the emperor, and Tojo was known for being an opinionated but serious student who lacked a sense of humour. He attended Army Cadet School in 1899, then went on to the Japanese Military Academy at the age of 20. A year later he had completed courses there and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. In 1909 he married, and over the years the couple had 3 sons and 4 daughters. 3 years later he entered the Army Staff College and rose to the rank of captain, and he eventually became the commanding officer for the 3rd Imperial Guards. He must have been a skilled and valued member of the Japanese military, as he then went to Germany to serve as part of the Japanese military attaché. Promotions continued for Tojo, and after he became a colonel, he began to become more involved in militaristic politics as he became more outspoken. In 1934, he became a Major General and then served inside of the Army Ministry. He was appointed the commander of the Japanese Army's 124th Infantry Brigade and was known for his quick decision-making and for being sharp. For this he was assigned to the Kwantung Army as its head of the military police, and during the February 26th incident he stood against the rebels and emerged as the army's leading political figure. He then became the Chief of Staff for the Kwantung Army and later deployed his troops to the Hubei province after the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The army played a key role in using the resources of Manchuria to utilise in Japanese industry. When he returned to Japan, he became the Vice War Minister and the Chief of Army Aviation under the War Minister Saishiro Itagaki. As he was the most senior figure in the Army's aviation ministry, he began to order aggressive preemptive airstrikes against China and Russia, but in July 1940 he became the War Minister. In this role he went on the front foot in the Second Sino-Japanese War and was a key player in forming the Axis alliance between Nazi Germany, Japan and Italy. Japan at the time sought to expand its empire, and Tojo was at the forefront of these militaristic policies, and he was seen as an aggressor at the time. Eventually these policies led to the Japanese being sanctioned economically by the US and by Britain. On October 16, 1941, the former Prime Minister resigned, and Tojo was then appointed to the post. He said, "I thought I was being summoned because the Emperor was angry at my opinions." However, 2 days later he was named the 40th Prime Minister of Japan. His first job was to work out whether war was avoidable, but it was reported weeks later that there was no way of reaching a peaceful solution with the Western powers, and following this the Emperor gave his consent to all-out war. On the 8th of December 1941, Tojo went on the radio and informed the Japanese people that they were now at war with America, Britain and the Netherlands. At the start he had the support of the Japanese people, as they made big advancements and victories initially. As the Prime Minister he was also in charge of the war effort, and it was under his control that many of the war atrocities conducted by the Japanese soldiers occurred. For example, during the Doolittle raid, where the Americans bombed Tokyo, a number of Allied airmen were captured and executed in barbaric fashion. But following the Battle of Midway, the tide of the war was turning against Tojo, and he began to encounter some opposition. He managed to establish, in a sense, some dictatorial powers, based on the support he had from the Emperor, and together in September 1943, both of them agreed that Japan would pull back to a defensive line in the Southwest Pacific to try and slow down the American advances. Tojo even tried to attempt to broker peace with China, but this did not work, as it's considered that during the negotiations he even planned offensives against the Chinese. The Americans continued to go on the offensive and made advancements against key Japanese areas and infrastructure, and more criticism came Tojo's way. Tojo then took personal control of the army in February 1944, and he had the support yet again of the Emperor. He planned to win the war, but under his command he launched a number of huge offensives. He ordered the failed invasion of India, which resulted in 72,000 Japanese soldiers being killed in battle, with around the same being killed from disease and starvation. More death came during the Battle of Saipan, with 70,000 Japanese members of the military killed, and the Americans had established bases in the Marianas, meaning they could inflict further misery on the Japanese through disastrous bombing campaigns. Following this battle, it was clear to many that the war was lost and that peace needed to be made, and following the fall of Saipan, Tojo was forced to resign on the 18th of July 1944. As the Japanese surrendered in 1945, the Americans began to search for 40 individuals who were suspected of committing war crimes and were responsible for the Second World War and atrocities conducted by the Japanese army. Tojo was sought for arrest, and he was seen by the Americans as the main aggressor on the Japanese side. His location was found, and 5 American soldiers were sent to go and arrest Hideki Tojo, but as his house was surrounded on the 11th of September 1945, Tojo took aim with his pistol and shot himself in the chest, knowing he was going to be taken prisoner. He saw it as more noble to take his own life than to go through war crimes proceedings. When he fired his pistol, he shot himself in the chest but missed his heart, and at the time the Americans were able to save his life. As he bled heavily, Tojo began to speak, and he said, "I am very sorry it is taking me so long to die. The Greater East Asia War was justified and righteous. I am very sorry for the nation, and for all races of the greater Asiatic powers. I wait for righteous judgment of history. I wish to commit suicide, but sometimes that fails." After he recovered, he was moved to Sagamo prison. Allegedly, he was even given a set of dentures here, and an American dentist inscribed them in Morse code, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Tojo was placed on trial at the Tokyo War Crimes Trials, and was found guilty of waging wars of aggression, waging war in violation of international law, unprovoked or aggressive war against various nations, and ordering inhumane treatment of prisoners of war. it was estimated that the number of deaths due to crimes committed by the Japanese army under his control ranges from 3 to 14 million. This was through massacre, starvation, forced labour, human experimentation, and horrific conditions. Tojo in his trial took full responsibility, and he said, "It is natural that I should bear entire responsibility for the war in general, and needless to say, I am prepared to do so. Consequently, now that the war has been lost, it is presumably necessary that I be judged so that the circumstances of the time can be clarified and future peace of the world would be assured. Therefore, with respect to my trial, it is my intention to speak frankly, according to my recollection, even though when the vanquished stands before the victor, who has over him the power of life and death, he may be apt and flatter. I mean to pay considerable attention to this in my actions, and say to the end that what is true, and what is false. To shade one's words in flattery to the point of untruthfulness would falsify the trial, and do incalculable harm to the nation, and great care must be taken to avoid this." On the 12th of November 1948, he was sentenced to death, and was to be executed by hanging. He was to be executed alongside a number of other men sentenced to death at the Tokyo trials on the 12th of December 1948. Tojo was executed a week before his 64th birthday, and his execution took place at his site of incarceration, Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. The men who were condemned were held inside here to wait their execution, and the men were guarded by members of the US military. Hideki Tojo gave his military ribbons to one of his guards during his incarceration. At the time, President Truman wanted photographs and videos of the executions of the Japanese men, including Tojo's. But General MacArthur defied this order, as he was worried about rebellion in the Japanese population, caused by the outrage if these images got out. 4 members of the Allied Council were brought in to watch the executions. Tojo, during his execution, begged the Americans who were the ones carrying out the sentence to be compassionate and kind to the Japanese people after his death. He also apologised for the atrocities committed by the Japanese under his command. Each of the men were executed in a similar way. They were brought from their cells to the gallows inside of the courtyard of the prison. These gallows were very busy inside of Sugamo Prison following the war, as hundreds were executed for war crimes. Tojo had his identity confirmed, whilst there were only very few witnesses to watch the proceedings. After this, he was led up the stairs of the gallows before being handed over to the executioner. A black hood was placed over his head, and checks were made to ensure that his legs and arms were secured. Following this, a noose was then placed around his neck, and a priest accompanied him during his final moments. Following the final checks, the hangman then pulled the lever, which released a trapdoor, and Tojo plunged to his death. The execution was done in rather secret conditions, to ensure that very little backlash emerged. General MacArthur's biggest worry was that the Japanese population would rise up in the wake of the executions and cause chaos for the occupying forces. A short confirmation statement of the execution of Hideki Tojo was released once all of the 7 men had been killed. After his execution, Hideki Tojo was cremated, and his ashes were scattered around 30 miles east of Yokohama from a US Army aircraft on the day of his execution. The proceedings were carried out very quickly. Hideki Tojo was seen as one of the key figures behind the Japanese war effort, and after the Second World War, he was executed as a symbol of war crimes committed by the Japanese. There were many more executions carried out of Japanese war criminals, but in his final moments, Tojo wished for the Americans to show compassion towards his people.
Tani Hisao was born in December 1882, and he was born into a farming family. He had a relatively normal upbringing, but then he enlisted in the Japanese Army's training academies, and he graduated from the 15th class in 1903. He was not at the top of his class, but Tani then was drafted into the Japanese Army. He saw combat during the Russo-Japanese War, and was promoted to second lieutenant as part of the Guards 1st Infantry Battalion. He had initially trained as an artillery soldier, but he transitioned across to being an infantry one. But following this conflict, he continued to train at the Army War College, and he wrote accounts of his experiences on the battlefield, and he interviewed many other survivors and published a book titled The Secret History of the Russo-Japanese War. This book was highly thought of in Japanese military circles, and it did become required reading for those who studied at the Army Staff College, but there were a few Japanese generals who criticised it, saying it was not an accurate account of the conflict. But Tani was clearly a talented member of the military, and he became a military diplomat and travelled to Great Britain as a military attaché from 1915. He then became an official military observer during the First World War, and he would report back the combat situation on the Western Front. Following heading back to Japan, he then worked as an instructor at the Army Staff College where he studied, and he imparted his knowledge onto new students who wanted to become soldiers in the Japanese Army. Tani Hisao remained inside of the Imperial Japanese Army, and he was appointed to become the commander of the 61st Infantry Regiment before he became the Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division. But then Tani became part of the League of Nations Standing Committee and was an expert on military aircraft, and in August 1930 he was appointed to being a Major General. He continued to act as a commander in different divisions and regiments, and further promotions came his way before he served as a commander of the Tokyo Bay Fortress. However, it was clear in the Pacific that a huge war would break out, as the Japanese sought to expand and conquer and look towards China. Hisao Tani had been charged with restructuring the 6th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, and in July 1937 the division was assigned to the Japanese China Garrison Army. They were then thrust into combat and fighting in the Second Sino-Japanese War, and they then took part in the Battle of Beiping-Tianjin. But following this it took part in further operations against the Chinese, before it became part of the 10th Army and attacked Chinese soldiers at Hangzhou Bay. Tani Hisao's soldiers then transitioned to become part of the 18th Division and the 14th Division. They were then involved inside of the Battle of Nanking, where they were involved in the Nanking Massacre. On the march to the city, there were many Japanese war crimes committed everywhere by the Japanese forces. There was a mentality of brutality, and there was even a killing contest that took place between two officers who had a competition to see who could massacre 100 civilians with a sword the quickest. This was publicised in newspapers almost as if it was a sporting event, and the score was reported like a football match. But as the Japanese reached Nanking, they issued a demand to surrender, and they received no response, and for this it was then ordered that Nanking was to be taken by force. What came next was chaos inside of the city. There was a heavy artillery bombardment, but from the 13th of December 1937, there were random acts of murder, assault, looting and arson inside the city. The crimes continued for weeks, and what people saw inside Nanking was hell on earth. One witness wrote, "The Japanese have looted widely yesterday, and today have destroyed schools and killed civilians, and assaulted women. 1,000 disarmed Chinese soldiers, whom the International Committee hoped to save, were taken from them, and by this time are probably shot or bayoneted. In our South Hill house, Japanese broke the panel of the storeroom, and took out some old fruit juice and some other things." The horror inside the city continued, and another witness said, "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of cases of brutality almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted corpses are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in without warning or reason, and killed 5 of their number and wounded the 2 that found their way to the hospital. Let me recount some instances occurring in the last 2 days. Last night the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were assaulted. 2 girls about 16 were assaulted to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, where there are 8,000 people, the Japanese came in 10 times last night, over the wall, stole food, clothing, and assaulted until they were satisfied. They bayoneted one little boy of 8, who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that penetrated his stomach, but I think he will live." It was Tani Hisao's forces who were part of the massacres and the crimes. For days the terror continued, and another said, "2 Japanese soldiers have climbed over the garden wall and are about to break into our house. When I appear they give the excuse that they saw 2 Chinese soldiers climb over the wall. When I show them my party badge they return the same way. In one of the houses in a narrow street behind my garden, a woman was assaulted and then wounded in the neck with a bayonet. I managed to get an ambulance so we could take her to the Kulo hospital. Last night up to 1,000 women and girls were said to have been assaulted. About 100 girls in Gingling College alone. You hear nothing but terror. If husbands or brothers intervene, they're shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality of the Japanese soldiers." Tani then following this returned to Japan and he became commander of the Central District Army before he went to the reserve. But following the bombing of Hiroshima, he was then brought back into active service to command the 59th Army, and these soldiers were part of the final defensive effort by the Japanese Empire to deter Allied landings of Japan. But then following the surrender, he was demobilised. However, then a warrant for Tani's arrest was issued, and he was arrested in February 1946 and was charged with Class B and Class C war crimes. But as he committed many of his crimes in China, Tani Hisao was extradited to the country to stand trial at the Nanking War Crimes Tribunal. When presented with the charges, he denied them all, and said that his soldiers were disciplined in Nanking, and he said the area of Nanking his soldiers operated in was evacuated mostly. But no witnesses could identify his unit numbers, and there was evidence presented to the court saying he actually operated in different areas that he said. But the judge refused his request to call his chief of staff and other officers to become witnesses, and the judge said that due to the witnesses who saw his soldiers rampaging throughout the city, there was simply no need. There was some controversy regarding his trial, but the ruling of the court said that all Japanese commanders who took part in the Battle of Nanking had an equal responsibility for the horrors that took place inside of the city, and because of this, they were judged as guilty. Tani Hisao, despite the fact he was not the most senior general involved in the battle, was sentenced to death, and he was then taken to Nanking and the mountain nearby where he was to be killed. There was a huge crowd that had gathered to witness his execution. There was a small firing squad that had been gathered to perform it. Many of the people who witnessed Tani's execution had been hiding during the atrocities, but Tani was then ordered to kneel down in front of the crowd. Then an executioner went up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Tani Hisao was a Japanese general who was convicted of war crimes, and he was a commander whose soldiers were involved in atrocities in China. He was a man who was in his 60s when he was executed in front of a crowd of thousands, but he had a long history inside the Japanese army. Hisao was a man whose direct involvement in crimes in Nanking was disputed, but he was executed for the fact the courtroom applied the shared responsibility clause, meaning that any commander inside of Nanking was condemned to death and guilty. The stories of Nanking were tragic and were horrific, and the whole city was a scene of depravity and terror.
Iwane Matsui was born in 1878, and he was the son of a samurai. After he finished his schooling, his parents wanted him to continue his education, but Iwane was concerned about his father's finances. Because of this, he decided to go for a career inside of the military, as it was cheaper than universities and other schools. Matsui was later accepted into the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and he was considered a brilliant student, and he graduated second in his class. In 1901 he was admitted into the Army War College, an elite training school, and he continued studying for a number of years. But then he was sent to Manchuria as a company commander in a combat unit of the 6th Regiment. He was wounded in battle, but was considered at the time an expert on China. He studied the language and he requested to be stationed in China. He initially was sent to France on an assignment, but then he would get what he wanted, to be sent to China. He was based there between 1907 and 1911, then later on as an officer in Shanghai. He became considered in the Japanese army as an expert on China, and he even struck up a friendship with the first president of the Republic of China. Matsui then continued to rise throughout the ranks of the army, and he became a major general. He was also the chief of the intelligence division of the Army General Staff. He left this role in 1928 to make a trip to Europe for a year. He continued to travel as a Japanese dignitary representing the military, but as time went on he began to criticise Chinese leaders, and he later resigned from active duty in the army. But in July 1937, a full-scale war broke out between the Japanese and Chinese, and this quickly spread across to Shanghai. Matsui was called into the reserves and was appointed as the commander of the Shanghai Expeditionary Army. Matsui was the ideal candidate to conduct negotiations, and he said his mission would be to make the Chinese people recognise the Japanese troops are the real friends of China, and that I'm going to the front not to fight an enemy, but in the state of mind of one who sets out to pacify his brother. But his friends would say there would be no friendship between Japan and China. His forces ultimately forced Shanghai to fall to the Japanese, and there was a large toll on Chinese civilians in the area. Matsui said that improvements should be made to Chinese refugee camps, and he even donated money himself to help establish a safety zone for civilians in Shanghai. But then he was appointed the commander of the Central China Area Army, and he outlined that he was determined to capture the capital city of Nanking, which was 300 kilometres west of Shanghai. He said that war with the Chinese would not end until it had fallen and was under their control, which would bring a collapse of the Chinese government. His troops were tired from fighting in Shanghai, but he made the decision to advance slowly towards Nanking. But they would commit scores of war crimes and horrific atrocities on the road to Nanking, and it was said that Matsui was not able to restrain the men under his control, as he was an elderly general plucked from retirement. There were large-scale assaults by the Japanese forces, massacres of civilians, and more horrifying acts, but as time went on in Nanking things would get much worse. Matsui issued specific instructions on how they were going to take the city, and regarding some of the war crimes that occurred on the route to the city, he said, "The truth is that some acts are unavoidable. Most of the buildings and civilian homes outside the city had been burned down to stop the Japanese army seeking shelter. There had been 2 Japanese soldiers who were allegedly battling it out to see who could kill 100 people the quickest, using a sword, slaughtering civilians with their sharp weapons. In Nanking, though, the crimes were endless. General Iwane Matsui gave the Chinese a deadline to surrender by, and he then gave them another hour before telling his soldiers to heavily assault the city. The crimes committed by the soldiers, it's believed, led to around 100,000 people being slaughtered in cold blood. One surgeon at the hospital said, "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling cases of assault and brutality almost beyond belief. 2 bayoneted corpses are the only survivors of 7 street cleaners who were sitting in their headquarters when Japanese soldiers came in without warning or reason and killed 5 of their number and wounded the 2 that found their way to the hospital. Let me recount some instances occurring in the last 2 days. Last night the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were assaulted. 2 girls about 16 were assaulted to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, where there were around 8,000 people, the Japanese came in 10 times last night, over the wall, stole food, clothing and assaulted until they were satisfied. They bayoneted one little boy of 8, who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that penetrated his stomach. Thousands of innocent people and suspected members of the Chinese army were killed, and they were shot dead, and their remains were then either burned, buried, or thrown in the Yangtze River." A witness said, "It is not until we tour the city that we learn of the extent of the destruction. We come across corpses every 100 to 200 yards. The bodies of civilians that I examined had bullet holes in their backs. These people had presumably been fleeing and were shot from behind. The Japanese marched through the city in groups of 10 or 20 soldiers and loot the shops. I watched with my own eyes as they looted the cafe of our German baker, Herr Kiesling. Hempel's hotel was broken into as well, as was almost every shop on Chungchang and Taiping Road." The accounts of the horrific incidents committed by his soldiers continued to reach Matsui's headquarters, but there was a movement inside of the army general's staff to remove him from power. The atrocities of Nanking had caused international embarrassment for the Japanese, and some wanted him court-martialed for negligence. He was replaced and then he accepted a job as a cabinet councillor, but he resigned in protest to opposition to an alliance with Nazi Germany. As the war was going on, he was in a sense at the background of things, but he did become the president of the Association of the National Defence Concept, an anti-Western and anti-Semitic group that sought to support the Japanese war effort. After the war was over for the Japanese, with the Allied occupation, a warrant was issued for the arrest of General Iwane Matsui. He gave himself over to Shigamo prison on the 6th of March 1946. He was then a defendant in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which was established to try Japanese war criminals. He was charged with crimes against peace and that he was responsible for the Nanking massacre. He planned to defend himself, and he referred to the conflict between the Chinese and Japanese as a fight between brothers. Regarding Nanking, he admitted he knew of a number of crimes committed by soldiers, including assault, murder and looting, but he denied the existence of large-scale massacres. He said he took responsibility for his men's actions, but that responsibility was a moral one and not a legal one. However, he was a man who was accused of 38 charges, but the judges dismissed 37 of them, but ultimately he was convicted and sentenced to death for his role in the Nanking massacre.
They said the tribunal is satisfied that Matsui knew what was happening. He did nothing or nothing effective to abate these horrors. He did issue orders before the capture of the city, enjoining propriety of conduct upon his troops, and later he issued further orders to the same purport. These orders were of no effect, as is now known, and he must have known. He was in command of the army responsible for these happenings. He knew of them. He had the power, as he had the duty to control his troops, and to protect these unfortunate citizens of Nanking. He must be held criminally responsible for the failure to discharge this duty. He believed that the troops were a disgrace for what they did at Nanking, and he claimed that the Nanking incident was a terrible disgrace. Immediately after the memorial services, I assembled the higher officers and wept tears of anger before them. As Commander-in-Chief, I told them that after all our efforts to enhance the imperial prestige, everything had been lost in one moment through the brutality of the soldiers. And can you imagine it? Even after that, these officers laughed at me. I'm really therefore quite happy that I, at least, should have ended it this way, in the sense that it may serve to urge self-reflection on many more members of the military of that time. On the evening of the 22nd of December 1948, General Iwane Matsui met with other condemned Japanese officials, including Hideki Tojo, at the chapel of the prison. He led them in shouting 3 cheers of banzai to the emperor. But in the courtyard of Sagamo prison, a gallows had been created. He led the other condemned men up to the gallows, and all simultaneously they were executed. The nooses were tied around their necks, and then the trapdoor was released, and Matsui, along with Hideki Tojo, Akira Muto, and Kenji Dahara, were left hanging. There are some people who believe that General Iwane Matsui was a general who was unjustly executed, but there are others that say he was responsible for the crimes committed by his forces. He was a man who, when he went to the gallows, was 70 and was an elderly man. But he has been referred to as a Hitler of Japan for his actions and connection to Nanking.